We use computing systems every day to communicate on the internet, yet we often take for granted that the English language is always at the core of these user interactions, even when English is not the spoken language of the user. This is because all computer machines and digital interfaces operate through the usage of programming language. Computer programming languages are structured systems of communication that humans use to give instructions to computers. They consist of rules, syntax, and keywords that translate human logic into machine readable commands. Popular languages like Python, Java, or C++ allow us to solve problems, automate tasks, and create everything from websites to video games. Think of computer programming languages as the bridge between human ideas and computer operations. It is actually our way of communicating with machine. However, these languages reflect the priorities and structures of their creators, which often means that they were shaped by Western colonial ways of thinking. And this is why it's important to critically consider how programming languages shape not just technology, but the cultural values embedded in technology. British colonialism refers to the period from the late 16th to the early 20th centuries, when the United Kingdom established and expanded its control over territories across the globe. This expansion was driven by economic interests and strategic considerations, and honestly a desire just for global influence and to be the best, to dominate. For its time, the British Empire was the largest in history, encompassing vast regions of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. The process of British colonialism involved the establishment of colonies and dominions, often through military conquest and eventual treaties, and this was very bloody and won through much war and much bloodshed. Colonial rule typically imposed British legal systems, economic structures, and cultural practices on Indigenous populations. And this often led to significant violence towards local societies, economies, and traditions. And it's important to note that Indigenous languages existed in North America for centuries before English was ever spoken on its shores. Colonialism is driven by the epistemological dominance of the English language, and coding languages are overwhelmingly written in English and use English based syntax to perform programs and execute functions. So they use words like if, else, and function in computer programming. And this reflects the dominance of English as a global language, itself a legacy of British and American colonialism and imperialism. Coding languages are grounded in Western epistemologies, favoring logic and binary thinking. So, for instance, computers really work in zeros and ones. Their underlying programming is literally just a series of zeros and ones. And this relies on also linear processes. So, these are also sort of the philosophies that are coding our technologies today. Before colonization, the region now known as British Columbia, or BC, was one of the most linguistically diverse areas in the world. It is estimated that 30 plus distinct Indigenous languages were spoken in BC, belonging to 8 major language families. This represents around 50% of all Indigenous languages in Canada, even though BC accounts for only about 10% of the country's landmass. The privileging of English marginalizes Indigenous languages and ways of knowing in these territories, reinforcing linguistic hierarchies and erasing the possibility of expressing knowledge or relationships in Indigenous frameworks and language. One way that coding perpetuates digital colonialism is through perpetuating colonial infrastructure. The creation of coding languages occurred in predominantly Western institutions designed to serve industrial, military, and capitalist goals, in the West specifically, so in places like America and the UK. These priorities reflect colonial and settler colonial values, such as control, extraction, and efficiency, rather than community, reciprocity, and sustainability. And many coding systems are embedded in technologies that create extractive economies, such as the mining industry, mining for rare earth minerals specifically. And this disproportionately harms Indigenous lands and communities, and also global workers who are working in these industries. Because of the exclusion of Indigenous knowledges and the development of coding languages, it results in a colonial kind of ethos within technologies. Coding does not account for the oral traditions, storytelling, and land based knowledge central to many Indigenous cultures, and it forces Indigenous peoples to translate their ways of knowing into a framework that may distort or oversimplify them. This creates a form of epistemic violence where Indigenous knowledge must conform to colonial systems to be considered legitimate or even useful. Indigenous peoples also have the political right to digital sovereignty. Indigenous communities have nation to nation relationships with international states that predate colonialism in the Americas. Yet, Indigenous communities face barriers to technological access, such as inadequate infrastructure in rural and remote areas. In some rural and remote areas where Indigenous peoples live, they don't even have access to working internet all the time. And that is now such a critical infrastructure within contemporary society. How could you do your schoolwork or go about any number of activities within your day without access to the internet? The reliance on colonial coding languages reinforces a dependency on external systems controlled by non Indigenous actors. Efforts towards Indigenous data sovereignty and digital sovereignty often require engagement with coding languages that are not designed for or by Indigenous peoples. And this really perpetuates an ongoing cycle of colonial dependency on Western technologies and Western programming languages. And Katherine Hayles is an American postmodern literary critic, most notable for her contribution to fields of literature and science, electronic literature, and American literature. In her book chapter, Trauma of Code, Hayles writes about technological non conscious. Hayles argues that as digital citizens, we need to be critical of narratives about tech utopianism in the humanities. She says we can't lose the principal difference between humans and intelligent machines because this is robotic colonialism. The difference between humans and machines is that humans have conscious self awareness, she argues, so felt relationships with other physical beings on Earth, and intelligent machines do not. They do not possess empathy or feeling or emotion or affect. So, this feels pressing in a moment where AI is becoming naturalized in our everyday lives because of OpenAI software like ChatGPT. We can't forget that technology at its core is destructive. AI searches have an immense carbon footprint that is perpetuating environmental degradation, like the devastating fires in Los Angeles. We should be critical of interacting every day with such destructive technologies that operate through resource extraction and global capitalism. Hales analyzes media works such as the Maramu Oshii film Avalon that warn about tech utopianism as a pathway to environmental apocalypse and technological colonialism. She argues that humans have somatic or embodied responses to the technologies they use, such as haptic feedback of gestural interactions, and these are cognitive, habitual, and repetitive activities related to sense, emotion, and physical action in the world. It can be as simple as how you press your keypads on your phone or the scrolling that you do on your social media apps. Those are haptic interactions, somatic interactions that you are having with digital communication. Code mediates these interactions, just like we use code to communicate with machines. So then, code affects both linguistic and non linguistic human behavior. Just as code is at once a language system and an agent commanding the computer's preferences, so it interacts with and influences human agency. Hales is saying that we live in physical worlds, but the ways that code impacts us can have cognitive and emotional impacts on our body. Hales calls this technology and code colonizing the unconscious. And this has profound implications for Indigenous peoples engaging with English centric coding languages. Hayles calls this the parasitic ability of machine cognition, not merely to penetrate, but usurp human cognition. There have been Indigenous aesthetic critiques in the academy in recent years that call on us to consider machines as kin. And certainly that's a beautiful and poetic logic, which is no doubt why it tends to come from the fields of art. However, it is definitely a poetic modulation on imperial knowledge and empiricism that does not address systemic colonialism. Hales argues that increasingly computers are seen as evolutionary successors to humans that are competing for the same ecological niche humans have occupied so successfully for the last 3 million years or so. So, machine development of language, the coordination of larger social groups and networks that make language possible, machines are now developing these systems for themselves and outside of themselves because they're learning. And the rapid development of technologies to make the environment more friendly to the species is also being developed by us. We are making life comfortable for them here on Earth. So, computers are even being bedded with sensors and actuators to be dispersed across the world to feel us better, to know how to colonize us better. So it is romantic to love Megan, the AI, for killing everyone who doesn't love her, but ultimately, seeing Megan as anything other than techno fascism is a facet of techno colonialism, even if dressed up in the rhetoric of kinship. Computers are not kin, they are a colonial enemy. Well, it's important to recognize the colonial infrastructure of code and technology. We can't overlook the Indigenous communities that have used technology to revitalize their culture, including their Indigenous languages. Indigenous languages in BC are endangered as a result of Western colonialism and Indigenous genocide in the Americas. Colonizing powers often impose their own languages on Indigenous populations through violent policies like residential schools, where Indigenous children were punished for speaking their Indigenous languages. This resulted in a generational break in language transmission, as many Indigenous peoples were forcibly disconnected from their Indigenous languages. Governments and institutions often devalued Indigenous languages, framing them as inferior or primitive. Policies aimed to erase Indigenous cultures, replacing them with dominant settler cultures and languages like English. For instance, the Indian Act, its primary goal was to assimilate Indigenous peoples in Canadian culture and eventually through urbanization. Canada never intended for Indigenous peoples to keep their Indigenous languages. English and other dominant global languages dominate media, technology, and education and marginalize Indigenous languages. And with an older generation of fluent Indigenous language speakers passing away, younger generations may not have the opportunity to learn their ancestral languages. Indigenous languages are deeply tied to worldviews, cultural practices, and knowledge systems, including ecological knowledge of the land. Language loss not only erases these elements, but also impacts identity, mental health, and community life. The First Peoples Cultural Council is a British Columbia based, Indigenous led organization dedicated to revitalizing and supporting First Nations languages, arts, and cultural heritage. Established in 1990, FPCC collaborates with Indigenous communities to safeguard and strengthen their cultural expressions. They supported the development of firstvoices.com. FirstVoices.com started as a media based language archiving tool, and it would grow to become a sophisticated, database driven online archive hosting more than 70 Indigenous languages in Canada, Australia, and the USA. At its core, First Voices is an interactive multimedia dictionary and phrase collection containing thousands of texts, entries in many diverse Aboriginal writing systems, enhanced with sounds, pictures, and videos. Using First Voices, Indigenous communities can document their languages and manage their own language resources. Once the data is recorded and stored, Indigenous communities may choose to make their language archive available via the internet for study and cultural transmission. However, Indigenous peoples did face some difficulties trying to implement these Western technologies in their community. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about traumatic code. Yes, it is a tool, but it is still a tool that they begrudgingly have to use or overcome to revitalize their culture. So, for instance, most of the 34 distinct BC First Nation languages and multiple dialects use a variety of special characters not available on a standard English keyboard to represent each unique language. Prior to the introduction of Unicode technology, computer fonts were limited to 256 characters, including uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. This meant that a typical font was already heavily loaded with Mormon based characters before the addition of Indigenous language characters. Further, a document created in a particular font and shared with someone else could only be opened and read in that font if the recipient of the document had the font installed on their computer. So, the sharing and installation of special fonts added yet another burden to the often non technical elders attempting to adopt computers into their language programs. Also, early custom fonts used by First Nation language activists could not be employed successfully in web browsers. Displaying First Nations language orthographies at First Voices and in related language documentation applications was a significant early challenge of the development team. Another early challenge confronting the First Voices team was the alphabetization of the online dictionaries. Unicode characters do not alphabetize in the same ways that Roman alphabets do. So that's to say, Indigenous languages don't alphabetize in the same ways. Further, every one of the 34 BC languages and multiple dialects uses a different character set and font. So, while these technologies have been helpful to language revitalization, they're still requiring Indigenous peoples to fit themselves within a box of colonial logic and language in order to do this work.